we can arrange all organs, vessels, structures in the body within specific regions known as body cavities. So let's start with the image on the left here. This is showing the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. Dorsal, for our purposes, is nearly the same thing as posterior. And I hesitate to say that. It's somewhat problematic because the top of our foot is described as being dorsal, and that certainly is not posterior. That's more superior. But it is also used synonymously with posterior, whereas ventral tends to be used synonymously with anterior. So what we see right here in orange is the brain and the spinal cord, and they are occupying the dorsal body cavity. You could certainly call it the posterior body cavity, but by convention, it's generally referred to as the dorsal body cavity. The cranial cavity and the vertebral canal make up the dorsal body cavity. And occupying the cranial cavity is the brain. Occupying the vertebral canal is the spinal cord. Both are covered in a layer of protective membranes known as the meninges. And then here in purple, red, and green, we have the ventral body cavity or anterior body cavity. Once again, traditionally, it's referred to as the ventral body cavity. And the ventral body cavity is typically broken up into three other cavities. So the ventral body cavity has the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. Thoracic cavity, and one could say the abdominal pelvic cavity. Separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity right here is a muscle that we don't see, known as the diaphragm, that we'll see in the picture to the right or the image to the right. Within the thoracic cavity, we find the lungs, the heart, some great vessels, the esophagus, and the trachea. All of those are covered by both pleural membranes and pericardial membranes. Once again, those are protective membranes around these organs. The abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are covered by a protective membrane known as the peritoneum. A litany of organs in the abdominal cavity: the stomach, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, the intestines, small and large intestines. In the pelvic cavity, we have the urinary bladder, we have the sigmoid colon. In females, we have the uterus. In males, we have the prostate and some other glands. So once again, this is the ventral body cavity, which is split up into thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic. We can see that on the image to the right here. Separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity is this broad skeletal muscle known as the diaphragm. It's the major muscle of respiration, but it is diagnostic in differentiating between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Here we see a number of organs in the abdominal cavity, a number of which are, all of which I should say, are covered in peritoneum, some completely and some sit behind the peritoneum, like the kidneys, which we don't see in this image, the adrenal glands, the ureters. Those three reside in what's known as the retroperitoneal space. And I'll talk about that in detail when we start talking about serous membranes. And then within the pelvic cavity, we have the urinary bladder, which we don't see, but we certainly see the uterus here with the ovaries. So this is the abdominal pelvic cavity. In this region right here would be the pelvic cavity. This would be abdominal cavity, thoracic cavity. The last thing I want to mention is a region within the thoracic cavity referred to as the mediastinum. The mediastinum is a space or cavity within the thoracic cavity that contains the hearts, some large vessels like the aorta, superior vena cava, the esophagus, the trachea, occupy this space between the right and left lung known as the mediastinum. So one could say the heart is in the mediastinum, and that's accurate. The heart is in the thoracic cavity, and the heart is in the ventral body cavity. That's it for cavities.